world is fighting an unprecedented pandemic, and everyone is affected. Sadly, the impact is disproportionate. It's disproportionate on minorities and the marginalized communities that frankly are seeing an increase in domestic violence, job losses, evictions, the lack of access to medical care, to medication itself, to therapy, as well as rising mental health issues, just to mention a few of the effects and the ongoing struggles of various marginalized and minority communities. How is the LGBTIQ community affected? How are other communities affected? Despite all of the progress that we've had made in the world, frankly, over the last so many years, in a broader sense on these issues when it comes to rights, for example, in India, where homosexuality was decriminalized in 2018, or in Costa Rica, where same-sex marriage was just legalized last month. Despite all of this progress, and given the overlay of the pandemic currently, why do homophobia, gender-based violence, and hate crimes still persist? And how can we at least look at doing what we can? And what are those coping mechanisms, as well as real longer-term solutions to support this community, as well as move forward on the broader global agenda that we've been working on for so many years? To discuss these and hopefully many more questions, we'll be speaking with this eminent panel that I've been talking about, and now I would like to tell you a little bit more about them. They have joined us from various backgrounds around the world, and we're very pleased that some of you have woken up very early, are spending your Saturday with us. And let me start with Leanne McMillan. Leanne is the Director of Global Programs at Stonewall, based in the United Kingdom. She also happens to be a fellow Canadian, and it was a pleasure to meet her in New Delhi not so long ago. And she's responsible for international campaigns, policies, and programs at Stonewall, which aims to empower individuals, transform institutions, change perceptions and mindsets, and enhance and protection laws for the LGBTI community. Next, we have Fabrice Houdart. Mr. Houdart is originally from France, but is truly a global leader. He is currently the Managing Director of the Global Equality Initiative, Out Leadership, which is the largest and oldest coalition of companies working towards LGBTI equality. Fabrice has also worked at the United Nations Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights, UNCHR. Our next guest, I'm just seeing if she's been able to join us yet, is Peppermint, Miss Peppermint from USA. And there we go, I see her on the screen, welcome. Ms. Peppermint is an American actress, singer, television personality, drag queen, and activist from New York City. She is best known from the nightlife scene, and in 2017 as the runner-up in the 9th season of RuPaul's Drag Race. In 2018, Peppermint made her debut in the Go-Go's inspired musical, Head Over Heels, becoming Broadway's first out trans woman to play a lead role. And last but surely not least, we have Joseph Koskov with us, the Director of GLSEN Research Institute. Joseph has done a significant amount of important work in the area of research, highlighting the lives and issues of the community at large, and has published several pieces to his credit on issues ranging from anti-bullying practices to safe schools. Joseph has worked as adjunct faculty at New York University, and GLSEN, he particularly focuses on, at GLSEN, on youth inclusion and inclusive environments within schools. With that said, I am clearly in exalted company and thrilled to be here and be your moderator for today. And I'd like to kick off the session with a question for Leanne. In a recent opinion piece that you wrote, Leanne, you highlight the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on marginalized communities, particularly the LGBTI plus community and also the BAME community, the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, which has had a deeply disturbing number of deaths in the UK, for example, where you're based. How does the claim that the virus is the great equalizer fare in comparison to the reality of what you are seeing and what we are seeing on the ground today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely a fiction when people say that a virus, something that's biologically determined, is that everyone has equal access to becoming unwell, or to actually not getting treatment. And I think that what has been shown, particularly acutely in the UK, let alone in other countries with even less robust healthcare systems, is that pre-existing conditions that may relate to one's physical health, but most importantly, to your position in society, will determine the outcome of how you get access to healthcare, how you'll fare as a worker in the system. So, I mean, we really need to cut through a lot of what we're hearing now about, how to protect yourself from this disease. If you're poor, if you don't have jobs that empower you, if you're not in a society that that doesn't have, the equality that is needed, we know that you're going to fare worse. And that's what's been shown in the UK. So we really need to step back and look at the structural inequalities that exist in society and why certain marginalized communities will always be at risk from discrimination. It cuts across race, class, economic wherewithal, poverty status, and so how your position in life will make a big difference. So I think that it took this kind of a pandemic to really sharpen the focus. Sadly, with countless deaths that needn't have been. Simply because of who people are. So I think the LGBT community, I mean, more people will speak to this. We know that they've faced greater levels of discrimination. We know that they've been more victim and targeted by violence. So if we're to do a global view, we know that what's happening in the UK, we need to pay attention to that and imagine and get the data about what's happening in countries with less robust healthcare systems and less democratic regimes in particular. So that's where we sit. So it's a fiction. It's not a great equalizer.
Well, thank you for setting the scene, and I think really, myth busting. I think that's important as we start looking at some of these issues, is to, be able to unpack them and really talk about what the reality is on the ground, because people often are relying on short snippets that they're seeing online or in news, whether it's real news, is it data and evidence driven analysis or news or not. And I think that's part of the job and the responsibility that all of us as an international community have in various respects, no matter what we're doing around the world. Ms. Peppermint, I have a question for you, and I realize that you have another event to support, Black Lives Matter, which is clearly, a topic of tremendous global reach at the moment. So I did want to ask you perhaps a couple of questions to ensure that we utilize your presence and take advantage of it well. And perhaps while we're on the topic of Black Lives Matter, since I mentioned it, could I start on that note? I mean, obviously the BLM movement has turned into a huge global movement overnight. The rights of Black transgendered people were highlighted when thousands took to the streets to protest against the killing of 2 trans women last week. How do you see things changing, if you do see them changing in the US after these latest developments? Is this a real turning point, do you think, in what you're seeing with regards to awareness, action, and so on in the US particularly, and perhaps with global reach?
I hope so. This is definitely the most active I've seen people, the most outraged that I've seen people, especially surrounding the deaths of Black trans women, any trans women or trans people in general. And so I do think that this moment of time is unprecedented. I've spoken to other family members who can remember other moments of great change in the United States with regards to civil rights in the 60s. My other family members, my aunts, my mother, and many of them say that something about this moment feels different. It feels like they described it feeling more widespread. And with, I think that is just something that we as queer people are obligated to take advantage of. I don't know how we couldn't, because we intersect with as trans people and as queer people, but as trans people as well, our identities intersect with all of the other demographics that we've talked about so far that have been affected by COVID-19, that are affected by, class, race, obviously gender, sexuality. And so as queer people, we are involved in every other fight, every other movement. And so it's only natural that, we acknowledge that these things affect us at one rate or another. And I think as for the Black Lives Matter movement, being able to see the protests and the conversations that started in the United States spread globally, it was very encouraging. And I think that just was a signal to trans people that this is the moment that we have to take advantage of in engaging in the conversation and letting people know that it's not just Black men who are being murdered unjustly. And it's a difficult conversation to have, but obviously it's necessary. So I do see some change. I guess I won't break out the champagne until we see the murder rate slow down or stop. But it is encouraging that we are able to participate in a conversation and have other people participate in the conversation with us in a way that we've never seen before.
Thank you. And speaking of things we haven't seen before, I mean, the Supreme Court also made a historic ruling on Monday, which, it's again seems to go in line with this narrative of a wave of change in the US when it comes to some of these recognition of rights and acknowledgement of various minority groups and what they're facing, and frankly, more than outrage from the community, but much wider. And this ruling particularly mentions that the 1964 Civil Rights Act does in fact apply to members of the LGBTQ community. Could you shed some light perhaps on the issue, just for those who may not know about it, but also how the ruling will benefit the community? I mean, what difference ultimately will this make, and is it enough? Also, does it have, again, global reach, and could this have further implications for the community globally? Curious to hear your views and how you see this monumental decision from Monday.
Well, I think one of the big trends that I've seen, not trends, but one of the notions that has occurred to me as a queer Black person is that although laws are passed in this country, even built into our Constitution, of equality in the United States, a lot of times, usually, people aren't able to really experience that equality because then there are other policies or laws that restrict people from accessing that equality. And so even though our country was founded on tenets of true equality for everyone, we know that that hasn't been the case for many communities. And so after 1967, I believe after Title VII was put in place and sex discrimination was deemed unlawful, and men and women were protected classes on the basis of sex, there were still a lot of loopholes that allowed people to discriminate based on gender expression, and sexuality. And it wasn't until, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't fully know the law, but it wasn't until Obama was able to have gender expression and sexuality, your trans status and your sexuality put in place as protected classes under Title VII. And so that was a moment to celebrate. It was sort of in exchange for the Equality Act, which we're still waiting to have passed in the United States. And so that is in place. And there have been some three court cases that made their way to the Supreme Court challenging those, basically that were trying to make it legal to fire LGBT people for being queer, for being LGBT. And they went to the Supreme Court in the United States, was challenged, and the Supreme Court made a decision to uphold that it was illegal to fire people for being LGBT, which is obviously a wonderful thing and a great accomplishment. And it came, honestly, at a time that we needed it. In a moment when every week we're seeing, from my perspective, I'm seeing a new Black man get murdered in the streets, or two trans women be murdered, or the president tweeting out his discriminatory thoughts or policies, which seem to be interchangeable. I don't know, they seem to turn into law, but they're not really, I don't know. At a moment in time when we're seeing these different actions and attacks on our community, this was a wonderful answer back, a pushback, not only to the president, but I think to people who really felt emboldened by the president and by this administration to continue to practice their homophobia, their racism, their sexism. Over the past 3 years, we've seen that these reports in hate crimes have been on the rise. Xenophobic and homophobic and transphobic and racist activity and sentiments have been on the rise, including from the president. And so I think it's more, to me, it's definitely more symbolic. It's not a symbolic gesture. It's the upholding the law. But in that, I'm not sure practically how much it changes. It may do more to change people's minds than it does their behavior at this point. But it's a big accomplishment and a big achievement for us. And it shows that you can't, well, I can't say it shows that you can't discriminate. There's still going to be discrimination, but it shows that we can't be so easily removed and legislated out of existence, which is what the president has just systematically tried to do with the military, with bathroom access, with job security, which is what Title VII was. I didn't explain that. It's protecting us from discrimination on the job. And so it shows that, not so fast, but hopefully that'll even turn into more action of being able to establish us fully, equally, especially trans people in public spaces, because we've seen these efforts they've moved away, I think, from solely attacking lesbian and gay people to moving and attacking trans people in public spaces and trying to remove us from having access to that. And it's only encouraged people on the state level to put these policies in place. When I talked about the bathroom access, when I talked about also with House Bill 500 in Idaho, where they've made it legal to restrict and basically ban transgender people from participating in sports. And that's their way of sort of legislating bathroom access and keeping spaces very binary in terms of gender and separating them on basis of sex. And so there's far to go. What we need is the Equality Act to truly be passed. But I hope that it does encourage people in other countries and other areas around the world to let them know that we are going to continue to have this fight for equality, and we encourage them to do the same thing in their areas.
Yeah. Excellent. Mr. Kosciw Suri is on the line, and of course he is the founder of the Kosciw Suri Foundation, doing a remarkable amount of work in India. And I just, listening to you and what you're talking about in the US, Peppermint, I thought it would be a useful, discussion point to take advantage of Mr. Suri's presence, and perhaps, if you don't mind, if I can put you on the spot, please, to ask you a little bit about in India in comparison. And we talk about, the progress that we're seeing, a little bit of a turning of the corner on some issues in the US. India's been on a very different track. It's taken a lot longer, for example, of course, and that's just the nature of the evolution of things. Do you see India also at a turning point, given the decriminalization of homosexuality and some of the other larger, rights issues, having some progress made over the years, and just curious to get your views, given what Peppermint has just said about the U.S. and where that is.
Thank you for that question, Ali, and thank you, Peppermint, for joining us. I mean, I could just listen to you for hours, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. In fact, thank you to everyone else who's also on this panel. You're all great and doing a lot for the community. As far as the Indian context goes, yes, we've just 2 years ago were decriminalized, and that's pretty much where we are at. Having said that, yesterday there was a small court ruling in Uttarakhand, which said that same-sex couples can have the right to live together. So they're not accepting marriage just yet, but at least we have this small little win of at least living together. As far as trans rights goes, on paper, at least when the Nalsa judgment happened, we had progressed, and on paper, as well as there is, there was a lot of work done, especially to what would you say, mainstream or normalize trans lives in India. But again, it was on paper. And when the reality and what is there in society is a vast difference. And now, of course, with the pandemic, we know that, again, marginalized and vulnerable sub-communities within our community who don't have the kind of acceptance that everyone else does, hence are sort of kept away from a lot of the economic stimulus packages and the relief packages, and don't even have social security numbers or bank accounts. So then you know how important it is to at least have these rights, when especially the world is coming to a standstill and where everyone is, put in their homes. If the rights were accorded to us as mainstream society, then maybe we would have been a part of a lot of these relief measures. So right now, yes, we're just decriminalized, but I'm hoping that this has lit a fire under a lot of our asses in India, to be able to sort of wake up and make sure that we go ahead for full equality. I applaud the Supreme Court's decision in the United States for anti-discriminatory law in not firing people from the community because of their sexuality. We're still far off from that. Right now, it's still in the court of public opinion, but I'm hoping that it's changing, because I think that in our society is so built on what we see, especially on Bollywood, and what we see on TV. And I have to say the narrative for LGBTQ has changed a lot since the decriminalization. And we've actually had movies and TV shows that have not ridiculed us anymore, and that have not put us into a sort of stereotype. And I think then even the court of public opinion, which matters a lot in India, is changing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that intervention, and thank you for accepting to do this on the spot. Fabrice, you've had a wealth of experience in the UN system, for example, over 20 years, and I think you've seen on a very global scale many of the challenges and issues faced by the community, some perhaps steps in towards the direction of progress, but at some point you also made a decision to move away from the multilateral system and move into the private sector and a coalition setting to be able to have more impact. And just given your background and global exposure, I'm curious from your vantage point, what would you say is, what are some of the most pressing issues? And do you see that we're at a turning point in a broad sense? And of course, curious about your views given the pandemic situation that we're facing now as well, and where that could be taking us on a more broad global scale.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge I can see is complacency by gay men, particularly well-off gay men. Yesterday I woke up and I saw an article by the American writer Andrew Sullivan that basically said, LGBT rights is over in the United States. We get that Supreme Court decision. We can move on. Now everybody is equal, and I of course I found that it was upsetting because it forgets what Leanne referred to, which is that the global situation for LGBT people is horrendous. And even though we have seen progress, particularly in urban areas, in the United States, in part of Europe, maybe in Latin America, this progress, as Peppermint mentioned, only benefited a few people.
Yeah.
People that are in the formal economy, people that tend to, speak English, people that, it didn't benefit all. And then the other aspect that to me is crucial is the suffering of LGBTQ children that you cannot ignore. And until we have solved that issue, we have only scratched the surface of what equality could mean. When I went to India for the first time in 2012, I remember I spoke to Anjali Gopalin of the NAV Foundation, and Anjali said to me, she said, what we need the most in India is support for the family. And that was really surprising to me, right? At that point, I thought that legal progress would be crucial. But what she said, which is incredibly true, is that for an Indian boy, particularly a boy, right? For an Indian boy to tell his family that he's gay is always a horrendous, disappointment. And the suffering that ensues is tremendous. It's very specific to India, but also to other parts of the world, that your parents invest so much in you that when you tell them that you are gay, it's a huge drama. And so for Andrew Sullivan to say, well, our suffering is over, is completely inadequate. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned, the inequality, right, in terms of progress. And to come back to the discussion that is taking place about race in the United States, what you've seen over time is that discrimination against Black people in the US has taken many forms. Initially it was slavery, then it went to Jim Crow, then now it's about mass incarceration and police violence. And what it shows is that equality is never a destination, and it is always a journey. Yeah. And as soon as you become complacent, discrimination takes another form. And so it's very important to not ignore that our journey is far from over. And I think, when I came to India in 2012, to come back to India, just to conclude this point, I was struck at the difference between what the elite would tell me and what the working class in India would tell me. And the elite would tell me, we're very happy with the status quo. Our identities, we do not really, the gay identity does not really fit, the Indian culture. And, but then you would talk to the working class and they would tell you, if I come out in the slums, I'm still there and I still have to rely on my community for my livelihood. I cannot put a buffer between me and homophobia and transphobia. And so what it shows is that the burden of homophobia and transphobia is particularly heavy on the most marginalized. And so we have to be very careful as white gay men not to say, well, we got that Supreme Court decision in the US and therefore the fight is over. In fact, everything seems to point out to the fact that we have only started our journey toward equality.
Yeah.
And I thank you for that. And I think that's a very appropriate note to bring in Joseph, who's done a lot of and continues to do a lot of work in schools. And really this journey for individuals starts at a young age, but often in many communities and in countries, it's just not even possible to be able to really address a lot of these issues head on. And Joseph, I think, what you've worked on tremendously through your work has been safe schools and inclusion and inclusive policies. And really curious again to hear from your vantage point that at a younger age, from probably the time of all of us went to school that are on this panel, what has changed now? And what's the situation like in schools currently today at every level perhaps? And really, what is the enabling environment that you've been able to create? And how has that made a difference in the lives of individuals, but also in the sense of notion of acceptance and equality and the idea that this is the world we live in, as opposed to being the other. Please, over to you.
Well, I won't compare it to when I was in school because that was a very long time ago. But it was at a time when it wasn't even a conception. It wasn't even, people couldn't even think about being LGBTQ in school. It was something that maybe you thought about when you went to college or you left home. But now today, I think that we're finding, and it's very empowering and inspiring to see sort of youth across the country. And we're seeing this not just in the US, we see youth around the world. We work a lot with NGOs in other countries that want to also focus on youth and schools issues. But they are really making their voices known, making their needs and wants known, making their identities known. I think, but yet it's also a struggle. I think that I'm fortunate to be a researcher in an organization that really values understanding the knowledge that we need in order to do advocacy. And over the years, we've seen tremendous change in the United States in terms of schools and improving in the experiences of LGBTQ students. But the fact remains that for many, schools here are really unsafe places where hearing homophobic remarks and transphobic remarks and racist remarks in the hallways of the schools are very common. The majority of LGBTQ youth experience some form of bullying or harassment in school. And we have seen these numbers decline, but yet it is still a large number of students who have these experiences. There are things that we believe work. We believe they're also sort of somewhat universal in terms of being adapted to schools, both in the US and around the country. But we believe that one of the most important things that students, that improves the school experience for LGBT students is having a supportive adult at school. So really having a school professional, a teacher, someone that they can talk to, someone who can affirm who they are and support who they are, often something they're not getting when they're at home. So it may be for some the only place where there is an adult who is accepting and they can talk to about their LGBTQ identity and what is that like for them and what their issues are in school. It's also very important for schools to have policies that specifically address sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression, along with other personal characteristics, and protecting students from bullying and harassment in school. To parallel what Peppermint was talking about laws in the United States, there is no national law that protects students in terms of discrimination and violence. And often there are many states that have that, but many of the states don't specifically include protections that for LGBTQ identities. So we believe that it's very important for schools to have this because students need to know that they should be safe and protected in school and that the school will do something about it. But it is also important at the state and federal level. There are several bills that have been introduced over the years and at the US government level, the federal level, that would protect all students around bullying and discrimination. And what we've seen is in past presidential administrations, protections around gender discrimination in school, so Title IX, sex discrimination in school, have been applied to protect LGBTQ students. However, what we've seen over the last few years is that those protections are really at the determination of the US Department of Education. And those protections, particularly for transgender students, have eroded over time. So this law is not being interpreted to support LGBTQ students, but particularly trans students. So I think policies as the second one, and I'll continue. It's also important for students to have supports in school, like peer supports. And in the US, we have a culture of after-school clubs. And so we have gender sexuality alliances, school clubs that are for LGBTQ students and their allies, where they can be a form of support, they also allow for collective action. A lot of what we call GSAs will work toward advocating with the school leadership to make changes. They will do trainings for teachers to say, this is what you need to know about the LGBTQ student experience. So I think the third is GSAs are very important. And then the last that we recommend and we think has made a huge difference in schools is inclusive, LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. And I think it's important for all students to be connected to their education and see themselves in what they're learning. And so when they are either invisible, they don't see any representations of people who are like them in the class or in the curriculum, it is hard for them to be connected and to really engage in their learning. With LGBTQ students, in some places, they actually are taught negative, they're given negative information about LGBTQ students. We still have several states in the US that have laws that prohibit any positive representation of LGBTQ issues in schools. And so when you have that, the students don't want to engage, they feel terrible, they have a poor psychological well-being and poor educational outcomes. So I would say those are the things that make a huge difference in terms of making school environments safer. I think what we're seeing now in schools in the US, as well as in many countries around the world, had closed. LGBTQ students have been in this difficult position where even though school often can be an unsafe place, it is also the place where they might have friends who they can be themselves with. They have a supportive adult at school, and now they don't have that. And so many students, LGBTQ students, are at home where they may not be out to their family, or their family environment may not be accepting. And that's why it's been even more important for us to make sure that people are connected virtually, and that we encourage our teachers who are the sort of advisors of their GSAs around the country to find ways in which to engage students so that they continue to have some sort of connection of the supports that they have had while they were in the school.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask Peppermint one more question because I know you have to leave us. So I know it's a little unorthodox to thank you in advance of asking you the last question, but in case you do need to leave us right away, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Kosciw Foundation and all of us here. We're just delighted that you could join us. It's a pleasure to see you again. Hope to see you back in Delhi and Kosciw very soon, amongst many other important initiatives like the career fairs and things that you've worked on and done together. One of the things I did want to ask you before you leave us is the role of media and social media in particular. I think you have taken your identity and your advocacy ability and interest and passion, and you've worked on so many issues in a very public way. And that has been very effective to reach, a younger audience, as we were talking about with Joe, whether those are students in school or just young adults, etc. I mean, across the board, right up to adults of any age. But I'm curious about your take and your view on the role of social media and how it can be a catalyst to bring about change. Or not. Peppermint, I think you're on mute. Let's try again. We're having some audio difficulties. Just bear with us for a moment, please.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. I made arrangements. I'm able to stay a little longer, just so you know. But thank you for that anyway. And I cannot wait to come back to India and see all of you in person. I really do think that social media is just one of the factors that we have now that we, meaning queer people and humans, didn't have in years before that really, it's a great tool that enables us to enact or at least work harder towards change. Obviously, social media and the internet have just revolutionized humanity. They've changed how we work, how we communicate, how we meet each other, how we consume everything from goods and services to entertainment. And so social media is definitely a tool, and I think everyone knows that. I think what has changed is the way we really engage with social media in terms of social issues, and really turning up the temperature, especially in the age of COVID. I think I really do think that, this is my own personal opinion, during the quarantine, at the beginning of the quarantine, I think we were many of us, at least I'll speak for myself, was taken off guard a lot, especially living in New York City, a place that was so hardly hit. And the amount of loss that we were lost across the board, whether it's job loss, whether it's loss of life, whether it's loss, there's so many losses that have happened. And I was sort of left wondering, I had a lot of questions during that time, and a lot of uncertainty, as I'm sure I obviously was not alone in that. But one of the ways that I think we were able to utilize our bond and our connection that was strengthened during the quarantine, because many people were at home, we were connecting more with family, with friends, having weekly Zoom meetings, daily Zoom meetings. We were just present in a way that we haven't necessarily been in recent years. And social media became the opposite of what it had served before. Social media was definitely sort of a distraction and a barrier to that interpersonal connection that I think over the past few years. Whereas during the quarantine, it was our conduit to, and our only connection. And so it took on a different sense of importance and a different significance, I think. It's the significance that allowed us to really engage with, in an undeniable way, all of these videos and reports of people being murdered, discrimination happening. And I'm talking about the discrimination and the people being killed and beaten and murdered during the quarantine. These videos are not new. We've seen them in the United States. It's not the first one, but for some reason, we were able to engage with it in a much more real and undeniable way that fostered a sense of rage and frustration that I've never seen before. And it really allowed us to connect and organize. We're seeing these videos on social media. We're speaking out about it publicly. We're connecting with other people. We're changing our hashtags and our pictures on our avatars to a symbol that connects with a movement, the trans flag, Black Lives Matter. We are organizing protests solely online, communicating about those things, and then figuring out where to meet or what actions to do. Online protests, the Tuesday, the blackout that happened a couple of weeks ago, that started as, I think just a sentiment among us. It started small, and then all of a sudden, major corporations like L'Oreal and other, like major corporations are participating in it. And so social media has played a key role in connecting, communicating, and supporting people of marginalized identities over the past forever, but during the quarantine particularly. And I'm hopeful that that will continue. I also know that obviously social media can be a place where people are bullied, a place where people are sort of can anonymously, sort of stalk you or dox you, or all these other terms that we were learning, in the age of social media. But I know that it's also can be a place where people can find refuge and find community, even prior to the quarantine. And so I think it is, I have a renewed sense of faith in social media. you know, in the past, I was like, oh, do I need to really join another website? Or maybe maybe I'll take a break from social media. But now I'm seeing that it's not the time to do that. It's a time to kind of amp up and ramp up our participation, our speaking, our connection. And I think we will be much better for it.
Mm.
Great, thank you for that. Leanne, I'm curious also to hear your views on the change that has occurred over the course of the quarantine period and due to COVID-19. Prior to that, I think, you've talked about legislations and bills that have been introduced that some were progressive and some, frankly, have been adversely impacting the rights of the LGBTI community. And in fact, the COVID crisis has actually been a bit of a cover for other things to occur and take place in the name of security or national interest or protection, when in fact, these rights are eroding. So what has been the impact, first of all, of the COVID-19 crisis on some of these rights as we know them, particularly from a legal standpoint, which you've written about, and where do we go from here?
Oh gosh, where do we go from here? I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm just going to try not to speak too fast, but try to be really summary in what I say. And I think that if we think of what everything has been said right now, why do we feel a need to celebrate the Supreme Court decision in the United States? Of course, we must celebrate it, but we really need to lift our gaze from these wins that we get along the way into what's really going on. And what's really going on is an anti-gender movement that is picking up its pace. It's got a lot of support that doesn't show its face, and that is actually working very diligently towards creating wins in countries around the world. That is a perfect environment under a global pandemic for these kinds of movements to flourish, because government's gaze is often in another direction right now, and rightly so in some instances, but it's proving that governments find it very difficult to do a lot of things at once, so under a global pandemic. So I think that what we're seeing, if you look at some of the elections or the sort of the new legislation is trying to be introduced in some countries in Eastern Europe. We're mindful of Poland. We're mindful of what's going on in Hungary. I haven't looked into it, but there are a couple of other countries that came onto the radar just last week. It's an environment where governments are able to take advantage of a beleaguered public and to look at public opinion and take advantage of putting in place more repressive types of restrictions. So if you look at some of the things that have been said in Poland in particular, and I don't want to pick on Poland because it's just, it's the one that's in the media right now, because the same thing is happening in other countries where they're speaking about things like the LGBT plague, as opposed to, anything that could be much more progressive, falling back on what public opinion is from faith and religious-based organizations. So there's these examples that I think we just really need to step back from and to say, now, how can it be? And, Fabrice will, having worked in the UN, will recognize this as well. And me, I've been doing activist work for almost 3 decades now. How can it be in a world where decade after decade, we have built a human rights architecture, which is all about equality and non-discrimination, that we still have governments that are able to behave in this way? And to basically, where's the project of dealing with what is quote unquote public opinion? If you look at some of the pushback on the Gender Recognition Act in the UK, public opinion is in favor of the changes that have been proposed. It's really now public interest groups, and basically a battle between, a fairly elite part of the community. It's just really, I think, a time when it's difficult when people are so beleaguered and trying to deal with all the consequences of a pandemic, which, as we've already said, has affected our community, disproportionately, to actually be always able to fight back against what we see governments taking advantage of. Sadly.
Thank you. And Fabrice, I think, again, really looking at the expertise you've had, looking at some of these issues on a global scale from the multilateral side of things as well for many years where you worked in the UN. Curious about, and I wanted to ask you particularly about where you see the roles of these key sort of stakeholders and actors. What should be the role of governments, or what can governments do to do more? I know it's a broad question, so I apologize in advance, and you can take whatever piece of it you think you can tackle in 5 minutes. But also the multilateral institutions, and maybe I'll sort of cap it there to make it somewhat digestible. But do they have an important role to play?
I'm like Leanne. I want to make sure that Joe gets a bit of time to conclude our gathering. So I'm going to be very quick. So I'm going to be super blunt. I work at the World Bank and I work at the United Nations for 20 years, and I don't count on them to drive LGBTQIA equality anymore. Those institutions take their marching order from the United States. They always did, and the United States is out of control. Now, it's not an American problem, Peppermint. I'm not trashing the US, It is also, it's a Brazilian problem, it's an Hungarian problem, it's an Indian problem, right? We have populists at a time of transition where institutions have disappointed the public. The public is electing those crazy men as a middle finger to institutions. So now institutions have to restore trust that the only way we'll get out of the mess we are in. And so what I believe in is that the private sector is what I'm counting on. I believe that the private sector has a vested interest to appear as a good citizen. People don't like the private sector. They think that consumer goods companies are poisoning us one by one, that the extractive industry is destroying the environment for good reasons too. They don't like the private sector. The private sector has a vested interest to reconcile itself with the public. And on the other hand, something that Peppermint kind of referred to, right? Which is that we are trying to find agency. Peppermint say we find agency through social media. We also find our agency as employees, as investors, and as consumers. And that put pressure on companies to drive social change. So I'm going to give a little wink to my friend Kosciw. Kosciw is a very good example of a businessman. Above all, Kosciw is a businessman. But he's a businessman that understands that it is good business to contribute to a better world. And that if you have the means to do it, you will benefit ultimately by having a more stable, more fair world. And so, that's what basically I spend my days on now. I'm not looking at the United Nations to drive LGBT equality. The United Nations, drove equality because Hillary Clinton, Obama, and Samantha Power used to tell them that's what you have to do. And now that those people are gone, believe me, the United Nations is nowhere to be seen. So, I'm counting on people like Kosciw to put their resources and their energy behind our fight for a greater world on all social issues. And ultimately, I'll say, what I love to say is that with the privilege of making profit comes great responsibility. And so, Kosciw, congratulations for meeting those responsibilities. And now I will let my friend Joe take us to the finish line.
Yes, please, Joe. Give us a sense, particularly working from within the systems, with however they are. Ultimately, there are, government systems, education systems that exist, and those are the formative years of many young people. Are where they're shaped. Where do we go from here?
Of course, we believe, GLSEN, because we're dealing with sort of the formation of young people, that schools are really the place where I think this is the locus of change. And I think we're seeing youth-led movements, both in the US and other countries. And I do really think that it's our job as not youth, as adults, to really support that and their voices. But I think, the founder of GLSEN, Kevin Jennings, once said that he believed that if you change homophobia and transphobia in schools, if you change the minds and you change the school, and then you're changing future generations of the United States in this case. And I think that there's some truth to that. I think that there's still room. There's a lot of room here in the U.S., and I think that in some ways, in the last few years, we've sort of regressed a little bit. And I think we're sort of having to make up for some lost ground. But I think I see this change in other countries with other NGOs that we work with, that it's really, school is the locus of where this can happen. And I think we need to talk about both supporting the LGBTQ students, but also having places where these issues can be discussed in school. Because I think when we didn't seek this out, but we see this even with our own research, that yes, when you implement some of the changes that I said should happen in a school, supportive educators, getting training for teachers, having sort of school social clubs like gender sexuality alliances and protective policies, we see all of that really contributing to the young person's well-being and achievement. What we're also seeing is that at the school level, it is actually changing attitudes around about respect and diversity for difference. And I think we're seeing that by talking about these and different, not just LGBTQ issues, but issues of diversity in terms of race and ethnicity and immigration status and citizenship and language here in the US, that you're really creating places where youth are understanding difference and diversity, and then that's something that they embrace when they grow up. And I think that, and that's why we believe working in schools is so crucial, because that's where change really begins, and that's what gives us hope.
Thank you. With just a couple minutes left, I was wondering if I could put you brilliant speakers and academics and practitioners on the spot, asking for one takeaway message, one piece of advice. If you could share it with us, to this audience that's listening now and will watch this video later, what is one thing that you would like us to take away today that we can look forward to doing and need to do given the current state of affairs? Leanne, may I start?
You know, oh, go ahead, Leanne.
No, you go ahead, Fabrice. I always like
Well,
your summary statements.
Larry Kramer just died. He was a big thinker in our community, kind of a difficult man, but people marked his. And he used to say, we are not crumbs, and we should not accept crumbs. And so to me, that's the biggest takeaway, is that, you know, it's not because we got a little pat in the back from the Supreme Court that we should become complacent. Our journey is far from over. And until there is one LGBT children that goes to bed praying his God to wake up a different person with lying to their teacher, lying to their parents, lying to their priest, we have a fight ahead of us.
Thank you. Leanne, perhaps? Yeah.
Tough to follow up on that, but basically, I mean, we're the ones that need to act. We're the ones that are going to make the change. And until everyone's equal, no one is equal. So for me, it's, you know, make sure that, you know, we turn all these paper promises that we've got into real action and real rights.
Thank you. Peppermint.
I think mine pretty much mirrors the same thing. I think we paid attention to and been very gracious and thankful to our allies, saying thank you for your allyship. But I think we should say no thank you to the allyship anymore. And your allyship needs to sort of transform into being a 100% 24/7 member of our community. It doesn't mean that you're gay or trans, but it means that you see yourself in the same way. You fight for us the same way that we fight for you. We march for you. You march for us, with no limitations. Allyship has limitations to it. They can sort of dismiss themselves. And so we no longer need allies. We need people who see themselves as members of our community. And that's what I think we need.
Thank you. No.
Actually, similar to Peppermint, I think coalitions. I think that one thing that, in order for there to be social justice and liberation for marginalized communities, we need to work together and in partnership. I think that what we see is there's a lot of, and I think it's well crafted, perhaps, by people on the other side of the political spectrum, that keeps us divided. And I think it's really about us joining together, joining in partnership, seeing each other perhaps as allies, but even as more, as Peppermint was saying. And it's really about coalition and partnership. And then it's about, and we talk about cross movement, but it's really thinking about it as one movement. And I think that it's if not all of us are having, or if we're not all equal and have the rights, then really we are all to blame and we're all at a loss. So it's about coalition and partnership and community building.
Thank you. And I'll ask Kosciw as well to give us your final words of wisdom.
Oh, it's going to be difficult to follow up any of what they've said because it's so beautiful. I can't say it any better. I think we need, we don't need just allies, we need accomplices. And I think that that's really important right now. I'd also like to maybe say that if we could spread the love and not the virus. I know it sounds so pageanty, but you know, it's very easy for us to go into a very dark and negative headspace and give into impulses right now, especially on social media. It's very, especially right now because everything is getting so dark and what is happening around the world. But I think that if we could spread positivity, how it changed for me personally was that I woke up one morning and I said, okay, what can I do to help in this situation? How many, okay, I have kitchens, we're all locked down. Can they open up? Can they basically feed the laborers? Can we do something on there? Can we reach out to the trans community who does not have access to their daily earnings because of sex work or because of begging, because you can't do that in quarantine. So can we reach out to them? Can we make sure that they have food and they have money in their bank accounts? And honestly, it helped a lot. And not just for me, but also for my team, who I think that this was another way for them to have positive energy. And so that, you know, they didn't feel completely and utterly useless at this point, because it's very easy to feel that. So that's it from my end.
Thank you for summarizing it for me, so that way I don't have the tough job of even trying to pull together the thoughts over the last hour. It has been an absolute delight and a privilege to be the moderator today, and thank you for including the High Commission of Canada based in India and myself as part of this. On behalf of the Kosciw Suri Foundation and myself and the High Commission, I want to thank each of our panelists. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Peppermint. Fabrice, merci beaucoup. And Joe, thank you very, very much. And Kosciw, of course, as always, it's a delight to be working under your auspices together to get things done. And we are not crumbs. We shall not accept crumbs. And on that note, we're signing off with you here tonight in India, but all over the world. Good morning to some and afternoon to others. We're thrilled to be together, and we hope to do this again soon. It has been an enriching hour, and I can't wait to do it again. Let's move forward. Let's continue to act, and let's make sure that this pandemic is something that not only we beat, but becomes a movement that in fact can strengthen us moving forward. And let's use the momentum on social media and everywhere else to take this, the larger causes that we believe in, up to the next level, because this is the time to do it. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for your moderation, Ali. Thank you very much.
Sending love. Bye, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a good weekend. See you soon.
Kosciw, sorry. Bye, Fabrice. See you soon.
Bye. See you soon, Leanne. Ciao.